Good afternoon. And we're just going to jump right in here. So I'm here to talk about military medical disability retirements. And there's a few things that I think stand out in most cases that are important to know going into it. So, and this also will address some of the questions we got in advance. But again, as Pat said, if you have additional questions, please put them in the chat. So profiles. Um, and I use Army terminology primarily, so if at any point you need clarification, please ask that as well. Profiles or your duty limiting chit in some cases. Anyway, that's going to be the first step to getting towards a medical disability retirement. So obviously, if you're on active duty, most people already know you're just going to sick call or going to a regularly scheduled doctor appointment to get a profile to say, I can't do XYZ, whether that's just your PT test or whether that has additional duty limitations. When it comes to reservists, guardsmen, it becomes much more complicated to get this done because you don't have sick call every day. So then you're going to be pursuing a request for a profile by going to a civilian provider, having them fill out forms to basically give recommended duty limitations. And I normally find that the best way to do that is to kind of follow along with your own branch's limitations and ask them to say yes or no to them. So if you have an old profile, or if you know certain duty things you can't do, you want to actually go prepared to say, these are the things I know I can't do. Can we include these? Get those recommended in there. But probably the most important thing about getting the profiles, regardless of whether you're active duty or on the reserve side, is what the basis of the profile is. So say, for instance, you have a bad back and you get a profile and ultimately it becomes a permanent profile. It's probably a P2. So in other words, you can continue serving, but you have certain limitations that you can't do. Maybe, for instance, you are not doing the run portion of your PT test and instead you walk. A lot of people, if they already have this profile, wouldn't go get a follow-up profile when maybe their knee is bothering them because the same duty limitations would be applying. That is one of the biggest mistakes that people make. And it doesn't seem like a big deal. It doesn't seem like, why would I go get an extra piece of paper to say the exact same thing? But the issue is when you ultimately get into a medical disability retirement process, one of the things they're going to assess is which conditions do you have that fail retention standards? And that's also known as which conditions have been profiled for a sufficient period of time that they know they're not improving. So if you never got the profile for the other specific conditions, now you're at a disadvantage because you're trying to fight the system to have those conditions considered, when in reality, you could have just gotten extra paperwork done at the beginning and had everything going up together. So that's just something that most people don't know, but if you end up in a formal PEB, that's one of the first things they cite to. Well, you've never been profiled for this particular condition or only recently. So if you know your health has potentially, like, you're not going to get to a full retirement, you know you might be pursuing a medical retirement, you want to start making sure that you actually do get profiles and getting them for the conditions. Now, just the Air Force, I am going to highlight this. The actual profile forms don't say the conditions, but it still goes to the visit. So what was the purpose of your visit? They'll go back to your medical record. If you were there for one condition and not the other, that is all they're going to consider it for. So it doesn't matter which branch. The main thing is making sure that each condition that you believe warrants the profile has one. And that, like I said, it doesn't seem like a big issue at the time, but it could absolutely become one later when you're actually in the process. Okay. Also, the importance of follow-ups. As I said, they look at your profiles in terms of how long have you been on profile? So if you get a temporary profile, it is important that you actually do follow up. And reservists, again, I'll highlight this, a lot of times what the profiles requests will do is say follow up in 60 or 90 days. So typically they'll issue the profile we'll say for 60 or 90 days, but you have to go back to your doctor. So you're going to have to get a routine set of appointments going to make sure that you're renewing that in accordance with the profile schedule. That way you don't come off, because once you have a year of profiles, that's when you're going to get referred. So you want to make sure that you stay on top of actually getting the profiles and keeping them, so that they can turn into permanent profiles, which triggers the MEB process. And also there was a question in advance about countering a presumption of fitness. Anybody who is nearing retirement, if you're close enough to retirement, within a year or 2 years even of retirement, you're getting up to the line where they're going to presume you're fit to retire, because that's what they're saying you're fit for, not really to continue so much as you're fit to retire. So if you're nearing that and you're starting to get concerned about your health, you want to make sure that you are accurately documenting profiles. The other place that this comes up is, and it's not just officers, but people who have very accommodating commands, or in a lot of officers' cases, their bosses will make the accommodations without the need for a profile. That's great. That's very, very nice, very considerate. Doesn't help you necessarily, though, when you get into the MEB side, because again, the profile is what counts. If you do have to contest it, that's something that you would want to talk to whoever's representing you, whether it be the military counsel or civilian counsel, about trying to prove that you had duty limitations. But those are the things you want to set up as you're moving forward, making sure it's covered in an official sense instead of an informal one. Okay, LDIS versus IDIS. So legacy disability evaluation system versus integrated. The default for the system is the integrated disability evaluation system. And basically what that means is that the entire process, you're going to have it referred by the military. It's going to go to the VA. They're going to handle the CMP exams, and they're going to issue the ratings. And then it comes back to the military to determine which ratings actually apply, as in which conditions make you unfit, because you can be rated for 100 conditions by the VA, but you still may only be unfit for service for 1 or 2. So this just has both processes going together. So whichever conditions the military ultimately would find you unfit for, they would use the VA's ratings. Whereas in the legacy system, the VA is not involved. The VA, instead, you have to pursue that separately. Most people who pursue or try to get into the legacy system are actually reservists who already have ratings. And a lot of times the military would then be assessing your ratings for you. They're still supposed to be using the same criteria, so they might consider the ratings you already have, but the military is who makes the decision on your actual disability percentage. Some reasons why you might want to do that is maybe you have a great rating from the VA and you don't want to risk losing it. That's a solid reason. That can't be the reason that you actually make your request for LDIS, but it is a valid reason. Other reasons are distance to get to a VA, the backlog at the VA. For instance, if it's a mental health condition, having to go through yet another CMP exam with a VA, often contracted provider, can be traumatizing in and of itself. So there's a lot of reasons that you can put in to request LDIS that make sense and don't have anything to do with like maintaining your rating. But that's typically where it becomes most valuable, are people who already have ratings, who want them left alone and have independent reasons for being able to pursue the LDIS system. And as I said, IDIS is the default. So if you want to go into LDIS, you actually have to make a request. It goes through your command, who either endorses or recommends disapproval, and then it goes to the local military treatment facility commander for final action. So that is definitely something where you may want to consult someone in terms of what to include as to why you want to make the request in your particular case to give you the best chance of having it approved. You can also pursue LDIS if you don't have a rating, but again, at that point, you are going to get your entire process. It's going to be quicker because the military is handling the whole thing, but you are getting your disability rating from the military without necessarily any regard for the VA's process. They're supposed to consider the same factors, but you don't know what you're going to get. Then you would apply for the VA separately. As I said, kind of the bases for the request have to do with the inconvenience of the integrated system, whether it's inconvenient personally, traumatizing personally, just logistically. There's a number of reasons that you could put in, but they do not have to approve your request. So you want to be cautious, and you cannot, again, put in, my reason is I don't want you to take away my good rating. That's, again, the most logical, but you're not allowed to use that. Okay. I haven't seen any questions jump up yet. So we'll jump right into line of duties. This is not something active duty members really have to worry about. Unless you're accused of misconduct, you don't ever get a line of duty because you're presumed to be in the line of duty as an active duty service member. However, for reservists and guardsmen, it's one of the most important aspects of the disability retirement process, because if your condition is not designated as in the line of duty, then you don't actually enter the disability retirement process. Instead, you enter the, you're no longer physically qualified for service due to a non-duty related injury or condition. And now you're having to fight again, you're fighting an uphill battle against the system. So line of duties are extremely important. And line of duty basically is just, you're putting out documentation that you were injured during an applicable duty period, a qualifying duty period. So that could be, hey, I broke my ankle while I was at drill. Or that could be, while I was at drill, I sought medical attention and was diagnosed with something. Some of those, when it gets into the other types of conditions, they have to kind of pursue those a little bit differently. But the other is, you could be looking at more of a delayed request. The ones at the time of the injury are the most obvious. Again, you need medical attention because of something that just happened, request the LOD at the same time, and you're putting that request through your command. But a lot of times members don't realize what's going on. So for example, maybe you start to develop a stomach condition while you're deployed, and you assume it's just, hey, it's the food I'm eating here, it'll go away when I get home. So you don't think anything of it. And then it takes, who knows, maybe it takes 6 months to a year before they actually diagnose you with some particular condition that very likely was caused by your exposures during the deployment. So now you're outside of the standard duty line of duty request, because they are supposed to be requested within 180 days of when you depart your qualifying duty status. So basically, when you come off orders, you have 180 days. Beyond 180 days, you have to request an exception to policy for them to do an investigation to determine whether or not your condition was caused in the line of duty. This is, again, where it gets a lot more complicated. In terms of how long were the orders you were on in the first place, what evidence do you have of seeking medical treatment? If you didn't seek medical treatment, what evidence do you have of the symptoms? I could go on for a long time. Line of duties could be its own webinar in and of itself. But that's when you want to pursue a delayed request and, again, get as much information out there as possible to show why you believe your condition was caused by duty. As long as one of your conditions that is failing retention standards is duty related, then it puts you into the actual disability evaluation system considering a medical retirement. You still may or may not get all of the conditions rolled into that, but you're back in the process where they're giving you the opportunity to be considered for a medical disability retirement, as opposed to just discharging you. And there is a big difference, obviously. If you are just discharged for a non-duty related condition, that's effectively you being like ETS'd. You're just out. You can try to pursue VA disability, but again, you now have a not in line of duty, potentially determination against you that the VA may also jump on. There are different standards for the two, so definitely still pursue it. But that doesn't go towards a medical retirement. That just goes towards VA coverage. So huge difference there. And then obviously the big difference is going to be between the discharge and the retirement. And a lot of these things all contribute, but if you're going to the medical disability process, any condition that ultimately has you found unfit goes into the disability rating. If you get 30% or higher, you get medically retired as opposed to discharge. Once you're in the discharge process, or once you're in the disability process, that's typically the goal, because anything under 30%, you only get severance. Severance may sound great. It's a bunch of money up front. And some people may need it, and there might be circumstances where it does make sense. But what they don't often tell you is that the severance you receive in a medical discharge process is actually an advance against your VA disability. So whatever you receive up front, say you receive, I don't know, $15,000 of a severance check, that $15,000 is going to be coming out of your future disability payments until it's paid back. So again, it could be beneficial for a variety of reasons, or maybe you don't qualify and that's all you're left with. But there is a big difference between the two, which is why you want to make sure that all of your conditions that are impacting your ability to perform your duties are included. It goes back to having them all designated in the line of duty, having profiles for all of them, and making sure that each one you can show its specific duty limitations. And what often kind of gets overlooked in this is the duty limitations. Obviously, the most common thought for people getting profiles is the PT test, right? That's normally what triggers someone to go get the profile, because they realize they have a PT test coming up. The bigger issue is the accommodations at work, though. What is affecting you, your ability to do your day-to-day job? What is affecting your ability to do your job if you were deployed? What is affecting your duty to do what should be part of your job in accordance with your MOS or AFSC. Whatever your particular job is, you need to know what's supposed to be expected of you and have those limitations written out in the applicable profiles so that you are covered. And then, as I said, whether you're in the ELDIS or IDIS at that point, though, the more conditions that are actually being considered as failing retention standards, that means more conditions being considered to determine whether they're actually unfitting. This is probably the most complicated and confusing part for a lot of people who are going through the process of, why am I getting a like 90% rating from the VA and the military is saying I only get 20%? And again, it goes back to what conditions actually is the military going to agree made you unfit for service? Because you can be impaired by a lot of things, but if it doesn't cross that line and make you unfit for service, the military will not compensate you. They'll kick it over to the VA. So that's why it is important to cover all of these conditions, giving yourself the best chance. I know that a lot of people don't, we're initially, kind of taught to stay away from profiles. You don't want to be the sick call ranger or anything. But as you go through your career, you start to realize how important it is to document these things, because you don't know where it's going to lead you. There is no harm in getting a temporary profile. If you recover quickly, great. You don't have to keep it going. You don't have to renew it. If you don't, though, now you're actually setting yourself up to be appropriately compensated if you do not recover in a timely manner. That's ultimately what you need to do, is you need to be thinking forward after you're in again, obviously, for the conditions that are affecting you or could affect you, making sure that they are in fact documented. And I mentioned the difference between getting compensation from the military versus the VA. Where that becomes the most relevant is the CRSC, that's Combat Related Special Compensation. That is something you apply for separately. There are a few questions on the medical disability retirement paperwork that go towards that question, although the actual statutes they cite back to are not for this particular one. But basically, during your MEB PEB process, they do give an indication whether the actual board believes that your conditions were combat related. If so, that helps you in the CRSC application. If not, though, it doesn't mean you can't get it. It again just means you need to build your case a little bit better. But CRSC is something that you apply for when you are retired, whether you are retired for medical, or whether, technically speaking, you would be retired for years of service. The difference is once you cross 20 years and are actually receiving that retirement, you would actually be double dipping the money under CRDP, which is just the double for hitting 20. So the issues, again, you have to apply for it, and you have to be able to prove that your injuries occurred as a result of combat, actual combat, simulated combat, hazardous duty, or an instrumentality of war. This is where it definitely, there's a lot of gray areas here. Combat's pretty self-explanatory, but what a lot of people don't recognize is just because it happened while you were deployed does not make it combat connected or hazardous duty. Again, some of these decisions are changing based upon, new rules and things in terms of the PACT Act and hazardous exposures. But in terms of actual combat connections, you are looking for what were you doing at the time the injury occurred? Were you running for cover? Were you actively engaging the enemy? Things like that. Simulated combat, that's where all your training comes in. So if you're airborne, air assault, if you're doing the obstacle courses, if you can in some way prove that you were doing a simulated combat activity, then you have a chance to apply for combat related special compensation. Hazardous duty is kind of self-explanatory. I mean, you have to prove that what your duty was in fact hazardous. But I mean, some examples would be people who are actually the parties responsible for burning materials in the burn pit would be a hazardous duty. I mean, fighting fires in downrange could be a hazardous combat duty where it's not actually combat related, but hazardous nonetheless. There's a lot of different things that you could pursue. That's actually the one we run into the least, I think, because normally another one already applies. And then the last one is an instrumentality of war. And this one is where it also just could be interesting. Instrumentality of war could mean that you simply got shot in terms of you got shot by a weapon. It could also mean that you were around combat equipment and that somehow caused your injury. So if you got, I don't know, run over by a tank, that would qualify as being injured by an instrumentality of war. That is not something that would happen in your normal civilian life. So it's making it this separate distinction. The reason CRSC is important is because if you get a medical disability retirement but haven't gotten 20 years, then your retirement and your VA money are somewhat of the same thing. What happens is they pay you military retirement, like you get your VA money first. The only way you would get the military money is if your military retirement exceeds your VA amount. You get the additional amount from the military. What CRSC does is it allows you to receive both simultaneously. That is capped right now. There's some legislation, proposed legislation out there to remove the cap. But you, in a lot of cases, are able to get more money because you're getting paid by both the VA and the military. The cap is going to depend on your years of service, your ratings, and ultimately the difference in amounts you're already receiving. So that gets a lot more complicated, and it's not really a webinar, something that could be easily explained. But essentially, if it's something that you're interested in pursuing, one of the first questions you would want to ask somebody is, based upon, my time in service, my disability ratings, and my VA ratings, would this make sense? Would I actually get compensation? Or would I just get you are entitled to it, but you're capped out, so you can't get it? Before you spend all your time and energy doing a whole application process, it's nice to first understand whether or not it would get you anywhere. So those are some of the key points that come up. And obviously, again, we may have some more in-depth webinars on individual issues, but this is just kind of a quick overview, just going from when you initially have an injury or a medical condition that is interfering with your duty, again, line of duty and profiles. Those are the first two things you need to be thinking about. After you've been profiled for a year, that should result in an automatic referral to an MEB. There are times where you can do it faster than that, where your medical provider says, hey, I know it hasn't been a year, but we know you're not going to recover in this amount of time. They may refer you sooner, but otherwise, profile for a year, you're going to get into that. As long as you're in the line of duty, everybody then gets into the MEB itself. And that, once you're into that process, is when you're going to make those LDIS versus IDIS elections and kind of start learning all of these next steps. But you're going to go through the MEB for what conditions fail retention standards. Again, that goes back to your profiles. And then obviously you have the opportunity to agree, disagree, rebut. There's a lot of little steps as part of that. But then it goes to the PEB, which is determining the unfitness, which conditions make you unfit, and what percentage are they making you unfit? Does it qualify for retirement? So that's where most of the fighting goes on, is making sure that you are actually appropriately having the conditions designated as unfitting and getting you the disability retirement at the highest percentage you can. Then afterwards, if applicable, you would apply for CRSC to then again expand your compensation out so that you can get money from both the VA and your retirement. Somebody did ask in advance of this, what is the chances of a medical disability retirement being revoked? Really, unless it's procured by fraud itself, if it's a permanent disability retirement, there is very little chance of it being revoked. But the one thing that isn't really addressed here is you could be placed on the temporary disability retired list so that they can evaluate whether your condition stays the same, gets worse, or gets better. And they reevaluate you within anywhere from 6 months to typically 3 years, depending on your branch. Again, there's some differences there, but they reevaluate you and they could still retire you. They could return you to service. They could change your rating and give you severance. There's a number of things that could happen if you go temporary disability retired. The main key there is if you are going to be temporarily retired, you need to know to continue to pursue your treatment. Whatever you're being treated for, whatever you're being seen for, keep doing it. Don't change things just because now you're not, in the military on an everyday basis. Okay, and then another question that came up was changing a reserve retirement to an active duty disability retirement. If you are already retired, whether it a reserve retirement, you would be seeking corrective action. So you'd be trying to do a board for corrections application. That's a separate webinar we cover, but that is what you'd want to look into is if you should have been medically retired and weren't. And there are obviously benefits to getting an active duty medical retirement over reserve, especially if you retired at the first opportunity at 20 years, went into 18, it's a while before you can collect that reserve retirement, whereas the active duty would be right away. So there's a lot of reasons why it could be beneficial to have the medical retirement. But if you've already retired, you'd be looking at doing that through the corrective process. So there's a lot of ways to get to this process, whether it's during the service. Obviously, the best is to have it all set up in advance so that it goes smoothly and you don't have to fight at every stage. When that fails, though, you have to take it each step, fighting each step as it arises. And if anything ultimately fails, again, you pursue relief through the boards for correction and try to get them. Again, you want to do it right the first time, though, because the military is presumed to have done things right, and it sometimes is a very uphill battle at the boards, depending on what evidence you have and how easy it is to locate evidence, depending on how long ago you were retired, or how long ago you were injured. And I don't see any. Does anybody have any additional questions that have come up during this? Because I think I'm already kind of out of time.
Yes, I got one question.
Okay.
Yes, I got a VA disability rating, and I was put out under honorable conditions, but now I'm trying to go back and try to get med board.
If you're already out, again, that's going to be a corrective action. That is certainly something you can do. And again, I do encourage people to reach out and set up a consult if you have specific questions related to your own circumstance as to whether or not you would have a case that is something we could help with. But if you've already gotten out, whether it's retired or just discharged, and you're interested in trying to correct that and make it a retirement, that would be a board application. Any other
Okay.
questions?
Okay, thanks.
As with all of these, if you do have questions, again, our firm is available for consults if you think you might need assistance with something. We also do put up a lot of information. There's a lot of webinars that go out. There's just other presentations, articles. There's a lot of resources out there. I just encourage you to look into them. And then again, if you believe you need assistance, reach out. There's a lot of things that just, it becomes easier when someone's helping you with it. So if there are no other questions, there is contact information on the screen for getting in touch with the firm. And that's pretty much it. Reach out if you need us. And it's been a pleasure. Hopefully this was helpful for you.